ask 3 to 4 questions. The last question you ask should always be, where do we go from here? Or some variant of it, right? There's a bunch of questions you could ask. It's not that hard to think of questions. But what you got to remember is that the questions in the interview, when they ask you, do you have any questions for us? It seems like you should ask questions that you genuinely want the answers to. That's what it seems like. You take it literally. You shouldn't. You see, that question is a performance, right? The problem is you get some candidates asking questions that are awkward for the recruiter to answer, right? They say like, well, if you were the CEO of this company, what would you change about it because it's not working? And they think they're so clever in asking these probing questions, and they're not. It just makes the recruiter feel awkward, and therefore they have less of a good vibe about you. You're the candidate that made me feel awkward. I don't appreciate that. So it's not about asking questions that, you care about the answer to. It's about how you're perceived by what you ask. Okay, it's a performance, just like every other part of the job interview. You're trying to make a good impression. And this question, do you have any questions for us? It's your last chance to make a good impression at that interview. So what does the recruiter care about? They're looking for someone who can do the job. They're also looking for someone who shows genuine interest in the job. Like they're genuinely interested in this job, right? So you can ask questions that signal those things, right? If you can tell them the hardest part of doing the job before they mention it, that signals you know how to do the job, right? So if you ask a question like, what would be the hardest part of doing this job? Would it be this? What would you expect me to learn in the first 30 days? What would be the most, questions like that. The third thing that recruiters look for is they're looking for a candidate that's not going to be any trouble, that's going to get along with everyone, that's not going to rock the boat, that's going to work well with other people, right? So how can you signal that that's you? You could ask questions like, about team dynamics, about team communication, things like this. You would ask questions like, how do people in this department communicate with each other? Or how do they get along with each other? How do they work together? Something like that, right? That shows you're tuned into that stuff. You care about getting along. You care about communicating well with others and getting along with others. So the fact that your head's there, they think, okay, this person cares about that, which that's good because we want someone who's going to care about getting along with everyone and fitting in and working with other people, right? So like that's those are the questions you ask. There's a million things you could ask, but to really zero in the ones that would make the best impression is you ask about, like I said, to show that you do the job. You could ask about, what's the most important aspect of this job, or the hardest, the part that's going to be the biggest challenge for the candidate that you hire. What would that be? Would it be this? That would signal that. In terms of showing that you can get along with people, you would ask a question along the lines of, how do people here collaborate? How do they work together? What do the winning employees do to collaborate with others here? Something like that, to show that you have genuine interest in the job, that you care about doing this job. You don't ask so what are the benefits? You don't ask stuff that's self-serving to you. To show that you're interested, you would say well, if I was to start in this job, what would be the first thing you want to see me accomplish, in the first 30 days? What would be the most critical thing that I should accomplish first in this job? You're thinking ahead. You're thinking ahead to when you're doing it because you want it. So questions like that, those are good questions to ask not because you're going to get all kinds of really cool, useful information, but because it signals to them that you're the person that has the things that they're looking for. Okay? That's kind of what's going on in that question. So those 3 questions that address those 3 areas. And then the fourth one is some variant of, so where do we go from here? What's the next steps? That shows you're interested, and that might give you something useful to know what's going to happen with this process, right? So you know if you need to follow up or you're going to hear from them or whatever, right? But it's about what you signal. So hopefully that makes sense. That's what I would say.